over the last several months, I led a group to engage in the job creation issue that actually deals with and responds to two questions that were raised in the audience when Mayor Gray was talking. And it's one that has been a bit of a puzzle for me. So as I mentioned early on in the conversation, as a business school dean, I want very much to have this institution be a part of the solution and to be engaged in a conversation about how we can actually move the needle and move the dial on not just joblessness, but also economic development and economic creation in this economy. I actually believe that our economy is in serious trouble. A couple of days ago, I was with the Dean of Engineering giving a jobs discussion to a group of alumni. And it was kind of a nice balance because he was on the one hand incredibly optimistic because, as he rightly put it, we create the best stuff in this country. This country still has an advantage in the global economy because of the innovativeness that happens here. And then I kind of came on and gave this incredibly pessimistic tale about how we're actually failing to deliver in terms of the job creation that harnesses that innovation. Now, my focus as a scholar is on the Chinese economy, and I think a lot about how China's strengths are really giving it an advantage in the economic development scenario, and even to a great extent what we can learn from it. And that kind of makes people uncomfortable sometimes because we still think in a little bit of a prideful moment that we are the greatest capitalist economy in the world, and we are the largest capitalist economy in the world, but I would argue that we are not the most dynamic capitalist economy in the world. Our system has been broken a little bit, and we don't seem to have the political will to figure out how to fix it. So these two things have come together for me because I wanted to be able to talk about the issue of the international economy, which sort of sits up here. But I actually often think that discussions of job creation, particularly in local urban areas, are incredibly frustrating because they end up talking about things in terms of very low-end service sector jobs, which are fine. There's nothing wrong with Walmart coming to town. But the truth is that there's a much more complex story that harnesses things like international development, international business development, and things like renewable energy to bring together something like a much healthier, balanced manufacturing economy that we cannot survive with as a nation, particularly in distressed areas, unless we figure out the formula for bringing those kinds of jobs back. So I led a team to think about these kinds of issues, and the goal was to actually take these issues beyond just questions of economic distress and the creation of a few jobs here and there, and think more broadly about how these issues link to economic development and more complex issues of our role in the global economy, because I believe today that we have lost our way, or at least a lot of the global economy is running away from. A couple of weeks ago, the provost and one of the deans and the chief investment officer visited Brazil, and they had many high-level conversations. I was actually supposed to go on that trip, but I couldn't for some reasons. And then they came back and I said, what was the major takeaway that you heard there from the Minister of Finance in Brazil? What did you learn? And they said the biggest takeaway is that Brazil cares about us less and less. They actually think that we're so backward in terms of how we think about the global economy that they're much more focused on China than the United States today. And that was a very disheartening story for me. Now, sometimes when we think about job creation, we think about things like the Works Project Administration and a heyday in which great economic stimulus packages were put on the table to really aggressively develop jobs. But this is what I want us to be thinking about in the era of job creation. I want us to be thinking about the U.S.'s role in the global economy and what it actually means to think about having a healthy and vibrant economy that really aggressively thinks about economic development, but thinks about where we sit within that global economy and where the multinational corporations that we are a part of, and many of which we have given birth to in this country, are doing in terms of their development process. So I'm going to try very quickly to talk through a couple of these key issues. The key takeaways, in case you want to go to sleep or head over to get the wine and cheese early, beat the crowd. Job growth is a complex process. There are no simple solutions here, and it takes real political thinking and political will to make it happen. However, FDI, now typically when we say FDI, people immediately think of foreign direct investment abroad. But I want to talk about foreign direct investment back here because this is the largest untapped source that we are leaving on the table, and that source is not going to stay there forever. And so it's critical to think about that. In order to do that, however, we have to reclaim what made us a healthy capitalist economy, which was having a very dynamic and business-friendly environment, and we are slipping in that area. Public-private partnerships are going to be an important part of this, but also long-term strategic planning that has at its core cross-industry strategizing. We live in a strange fallacy today, a way of thinking in which we believe that governments are fundamentally bad and markets can solve all of our solutions. But the best, most dynamic economies in the world today actually have governments that are not debating issues of entitlements, but are instead thinking aggressively about how to strategize and how to coordinate across industries for their economies. We cannot afford not to do that today. We are in a country, for example, that hasn't had an energy policy since the mid-1970s. And we wonder why we're losing the game of renewable energy. That's why. So it has to happen, and we have to pick up that part of the democratic process today. Now, typically, as I mentioned, when we think about FDI and international job development, we think about things like trade imbalances. If we could just get the Chinese to revalue their currency, everything would be good, right? Right? That's what it's all about. Has nothing to do with the issue. Let me make one thing clear. If you take away one thing, currency revaluation is not going to solve our economic problems. Things like long-term strategizing around vocational education, skilled labor, a healthy investment environment in which the state leads investment are going to be the cores of this. Now, we often don't only think about currency revaluation as the source of our problems, but we also talk about things like China stealing our jobs. Here again, China is not stealing our jobs. We have an unhealthy economic environment in which we are pushing those jobs out the door. Now, the main thing I want to talk about, I talked about the largest untapped resource in the world today. Just one country. I'm going to talk mostly about one country that I know the best, but it's the one that we need to have a healthy relationship with, and we are at risk of driving a wedge that is so deep that this country is not going to be engaged with us for much longer. China is sitting on, we all hear about debt in the form of the treasuries, and that's about $2 billion that they're funding of our own debt, right? But that's not even the most interesting money out there. China is sitting on about $3 trillion of cash, right? Now, what does that mean? China could easily buy Google, Apple, IBM, and a major resources company and not even be close to putting a dent in that amount of money. They could also buy all of the taxable property in Washington, D.C., which runs at about $250 billion, or in Manhattan, which is about $280 billion, right? This is a tremendous amount of money. China could be primed to invest to the tune of about $200 billion a year in this country over a year for the next 10 years, right? Now, that sounds really exciting, right? The problem is, we don't really want that money. Seriously. It's kind of an amazing thing, but the way that we have positioned ourselves vis-a-vis China and the rest of the foreign and direct investment community, we're basically saying we don't want that money. Now, sometimes when I give talks about this, people will stand up and say, yeah, but we're America. We're incredibly innovative. We've come out of recessions before. And that's true. But we haven't come out of recessions in which we have eviscerated vocational education for a 30-year period so that we don't have skilled labor anymore. We don't have the luxury of this anymore because we are actually in a situation in which we are at the tail end of a globalization cycle in which we have shipped $3 trillion out the door. That money has to go somewhere for it to have value for the Chinese economy, and I can tell you that if it doesn't come back here, the Chinese will find a place to spend it. But they won't be here. They'll spend it in Brazil and Europe. Okay, and Africa probably. And so if we don't actually figure out how to fix the political system so that we welcome that type of cash back, we're going to be in a lot of trouble. Now, the good news is that the United States is often viewed as a safe haven for foreign direct investment. We're generally reviewed as a fairly stable environment, politically and economically, although we were recently downgraded, as I'm sure everybody knows, but so maybe a little less stable economically than before. But of course, we're not going to default. Like, that's not going to happen in this country, right? This is still a good economic bet. We are also the largest consumer economy in the world, and so there are many Chinese companies that actually want desperately to be here, and there are many different sectors that they may want to invest in. So the benefits of FDI in the U.S. are tremendous. They have to do with creating new jobs, first and foremost. So we want to talk about jobs. Let's talk about jobs. Let's talk about $3 trillion in cash that's sitting at our door and we don't want back in. It also boosts wages, because if you look at companies like Toyota that invested in the United States in the 1980s, they re-energized the economic sector that they were competing in very fundamental ways. In addition, it spurs strength in the manufacturing industry, which is crucial. We cannot survive economically if we don't reinvigorate manufacturing in some fundamental ways. And there's a very nice moment that we're sitting on, because the global economy in manufacturing is built on $40 a barrel oil, right? But that's not what oil costs anymore, right? Oil's $100 a barrel. And so there is a huge opportunity for the U.S. to recapture a lot of what it has in manufacturing, because the economics are changing in terms of the transportation. It brings new research and technology. One of the worst things that has happened to this economy since 2001 has been the closing of our doors to immigrants. Immigration is a big debate, and it's a political hot potato, but make no mistake about it. The productivity revolution that occurred in this country from 1950 to 2000 was built on the backs of immigrants that came from places like China and India. More than 50% of the people, the technical people that live in Silicon Valley, are from outside of this country. Right? Now, if we close our doors and people don't come anymore because we say in our university systems we don't want them, and as a professor and as a dean, I see this more and more. Right? It is harder and harder for students to get here, and they come less and less. And that's just a travesty, in my opinion. And it contributes to rising U.S. productivity. Finally, it contributes to U.S. tax revenues, which is crucial. Now, I'm going to just speed through a couple of examples of how this has all happened, because I want to keep us on time. But one of the things that I do want to point out here is that take note of the decline in U.S. competitiveness. So this is an annual survey that's done. It's called the FDI Confidence Index. And for many, many years, we were at the top of that hierarchical heap. But over the last decade, we have declined, and we're no longer viewed as the most inviting economy in the world. You know what country is? China. Now, I want to tell a couple of quick stories, but before I do, I just want to mention one thing. I talked about $3 trillion. Do you know how much money is coming into the door from China to here? The net total has been in the last decade about $722 million. That's a tiny, tiny number. China is barely, it doesn't even count as a percentage of what it is that we take in terms of FDI. Now, I want to tell you a couple quick stories and then I'll wrap up. So I said that we're pushing jobs out of this country. Let's use the example that one gentleman in the audience raised, which is the issue of renewable energy. Right? Maybe in January you might have read a story about Evergreen Solar, which was another case in which China was stealing our jobs. Right? Evergreen Solar packed. It was a renewable energy company in Massachusetts. They pulled up stakes and moved to Wuhan. Now, what most people didn't know about Evergreen Solar was that 1/7 of Evergreen Solar's bond issuance came from Lehman Brothers. When Lehman collapsed, Evergreen went to the federal government and said, we need help because we just lost 1/7 of our valuation in terms of our underwriting value. They said, you're not eligible for TARP money because you're not a financial organization. So they said, well, can you get the banks to start lending the money? And they said, well, the banks will do what the banks do because we can't mandate this. This is the market economy. So the banks wouldn't lend them any money. And then it turned out that China, usually when it does a deal with a solar energy company, whether it's Evergreen Solar in their area or it's DuPont building their photovoltaic arrays, they'll guarantee procurement prices in renewable energy. The amount that's being invested in renewable energy right now dwarfs anything that's going on in the United States. And so there's a reason why, despite the fact that the United States has the best technology in renewable energy, China leads the world in both production and consumption of renewable energy. Think about that. Here's a country that we typically think of as being the worst pollution place in the industrial world, but in fact, they're leading the world in production and consumption of renewable energy. And in part, it's because they're investing heavily from the governmental side. And that's a very sobering story, I think. The second story that I want to tell is actually interestingly related to Mayor Gray. He didn't mention this, but when he was at the Tech Meetup conference on Friday night, he and I was there with him, and we were actually there with Charles Ding, who's the president of Huawei North America. And so I want to tell you a little story that actually is, again, very sobering in terms of what we're doing with the U.S. economy. Huawei is a company, this is the second largest telecommunications infrastructure company in the world. Most people don't realize that they are just behind Ericsson in terms of their size. They're not a publicly traded company, so they often sort of fall off the map in the discussions. They will be number one. They will be the largest telecommunications infrastructure company in the world before long. They want desperately to invest in the United States, and they are very rich. They have done very well over the course of the last 25 years. They put in a bid to basically, it was a competitive bid that Sprint Nortel put out to have all of their switching infrastructure upgraded. Right? Sprint said, we're going to go with them for sure. This is the best company out there. This is the one that we want. And by the way, they're offering product cheap. This is going to add $1 billion to our bottom line. This is the deal we're going with. At the last minute, the 11th hour, the United States government, driven by about 6 people on the Hill, several of whom, by the way, you can check their PAC funding online. They get their money from Cisco and Motorola. Okay? A call was placed to the White House, and they said, if you do this deal, we're going to attack you in the 2012 election for being engaged with an authoritarian government and for opening our doors to cybersecurity. Cybersecurity issue is interesting, by the way, because Huawei is the only telecommunication company that uses a third-party vendor to actually check their source code to make sure that they're not violating any cybersecurity issues. This was done purely for political reasons. Now, what Huawei then did is they said, well, I guess we can't do business here. And so they immediately moved about 1,000 jobs from New Jersey to Toronto. Right? So we want to talk about job creation. Let's be serious. Let's actually talk about what is going on in this country in terms of the actual political stalemate that's happening. And Huawei is just one of many examples that we're having that problem with. The Chinese case has been quite significant, and this is a long-standing one. The U.S. Congress stepped in when Chinese National Offshore Oil Company made a bid to buy Unocal, perfectly legal market deal. They stepped in when Haier tried to buy Maytag. Now, maybe oil I can understand, but are washing machines national security issues? I'm just not clear on what the logic is on this. Now, in terms of taking this to job creation at local levels, I actually think that this is where the D.C. government has a tremendous opportunity. And what I've been trying to do with the Huawei executives is convince them that most people think about Washington as a lobbying town. Right? And they actually have a lobbying office here. But it's also useful and important to think about it as a place where if you create jobs, you'll actually get a good political visibility just by doing good within this economy, right? And so there's lots of opportunity here in D.C. that is special opportunity, right? Imagine if Huawei, actually the president of Huawei North America just moved from Plano to Bethesda, and so things look good on that front. But imagine if every company like that, PetroChina, which has an image problem because of its deal with the Sudan, right? Imagine that they come here and they create jobs and they become a part of the solution for economic development. What then are we actually trading on? Because they get good recognition, but they've also helped the city in terms of job creation. And so I just want to leave us with the notion that we've talked about many different things today, but I want us to not forget about the international economy and about manufacturing. It's challenging to make these links. I actually had a conversation with somebody yesterday about this event, and somebody challenged me and said, what are you going to talk about in terms of international business that has any implications for Ward 8? And I actually told him, Mrs. Richardson, about our lunch and how you actually got excited about these ideas, because there is something here. There is something that we can do to actually use this discussion and these resources that fly around up here and we think about in terms of macroeconomic trade issues, but we don't think about in terms of local job creation. And I actually think there's a huge opportunity for this.